Hey, welcome to Office Hours. I am going to talk about transitions today, and specifically I'm going to go into transitions in fiction. I'm going to save transitions in nonfiction for a different session. I'm actually trying to get someone who I perceive to be the ultimate expert in nonfiction transitions to do an interview, because I think she will be able to explain nonfiction transitions much better than I will. So transitions are the things that go in between everything, right? Um, in fiction, they can be a change of place. So whether you are moving from one room in a house to another, from one building to another in the same city, from one city to a different city, from one, region like a mountain range to a desert, something like that. Any kind of change in place is a form of transition. And the same with changes of time. So if there's a gap in time, then you need a transition to let the reader know that. If it's 5 minutes later, then nobody cares. But if it's a significant break in time, maybe you're writing a crime novel or a thriller or something, and that 5 minute gap is a time during which something bad happens, like the victim gets killed or something, then it's important to have a transition that's really clear for that, make it clear that 5 minutes happened. If it's something like, there's a journey from New York to San Francisco and nothing exciting happens on the airplane, she doesn't have any realizations, she just slept the whole time. Maybe you just have one sentence that says, the trip was uneventful and I slept on the whole way. You can also have transitions that show a change in mental state, or a change in emotional state. And those are usually really important parts of the actual plot of the story, right? Because those changes are what lead the actions to move forward. It leads the story to move forward, whether it's a realization that someone did something that you didn't think they were capable of doing, or that you realize something about yourself, you realize that you're approaching the problem wrong. Anything like that, those internal changes often are very important to make very clear, but it's still a transition. Even if it takes up the bulk of the scene, it's a change. You're transitioning from point A to point B. You're transitioning from being happy and excited to being really frustrated and angry, or you're transitioning from being sad to being less sad or more sad. Those are the big umbrella categories for fiction transitions. These transitions, as I sort of mentioned a little bit, they can be long or they can be short. I have a fiction series, a fantasy series that I'm working on. I've been working on it for a very long time. It's kind of my baby. Every author has their baby story. And I've been taking my time with this story because I want it to be as good as it can be before I release it. But the majority of the first book is a transition in place. The characters are moving from one city to another city to another city. So there's 3 cities, there's 3 stopping points throughout the book. And a large part of important stuff that happens between the characters, important realizations they have about things they thought were mythical that aren't, things they thought were true that aren't, those sorts of mental, emotional changes happen as they're on the boring part of the journey, where they're walking from place A to place B. And so I have that transition of place be really long because there's a lot of important stuff that goes on during that transition. But the transition in comparison from one mental state to the next is, within a few sentences inside of a scene, inside of something else that's going on. And that's, that makes sense, I think, for a lot of fantasy novels. If you think of the Lord of the Rings, it's very similar. The whole The whole entire trilogy is about getting the ring from the Shire to Mount Doom. So that's like the whole transition in place is one trilogy long. Whereas, the realization that Frodo needs to leave the Shire happens in one chapter. The realization that Frodo has to be the one to take the ring all the way and not just to Rivendell happens in one scene. So it's kind of common for fantasy to have long transitions of place in comparison to the other transitions. Whereas a lot of times fantasy has a short transition in time. If there's a span of time that's like a week or a few years where nothing interesting happens, then it's covered in a sentence or two at the beginning of the next chapter or beginning of the next scene. And again, you can think of this in The Lord of the Rings. There's a chapter break, I think, between when Bilbo retires at the end of his party. He goes off to wander around. And then the next chapter is all about how Gandalf has come back to realize that the ring is not what he thought it was, and to get Frodo to start taking action. And there's a few paragraphs there because Tolkien is long-winded a little bit. No offense. I love The Lord of the Rings, but it is a time commitment to read all the way through. So that transition in time is like several years pass in that space. And it's covered in a few paragraphs at most. Whereas, in something more literary, maybe that transition of time is stretched out longer if it's more important. But then maybe again, maybe it's not. It really depends on the story. So you have to understand what you're writing about to know whether a short transition or a long transition is going to work better. And you probably want a good variety of those to keep it interesting, and don't, like, this is something I'm struggling with a little bit with Sorceress and Beastly. I have a bunch of episodes and they are chronologically happening like one day after the next. But I need there to be a really, really long time gap in between the end of season 1 and the beginning of season 2, and that feels really abrupt to me. It feels awkward. And so I'm trying to figure out how to put in some longer time gaps into the journey that happens within season 1 so that longer time gap in between the seasons doesn't feel so disconcerting to the reader. So it's something to think about as you're revising, as you're going through, as you're checking to make sure all of your events make sense in the context of the whole story. To think about whether you have short or long transitions and whether it makes sense that those transitions are short or long or in between, and to make sure you have appropriate transitions for time, place, and changes in mental and emotional state. Your transitions work if your beta readers don't feel lost. So you want your reader to know that there's been a change in place or a change in time. You want them to know, okay, just because 2 scenes ago this person had this opinion, now they have a different opinion because they've had a change in mental state or a change in emotional state that has caused them to change their mind. And you make it clear to your reader that change has happened so that they're not confused, right? You don't want your reader to be confused about what has happened already. You want them to be wondering and curious about what's going to happen next. If they're confused about what happened before, that's when they're going to either go back and reread things, or they're just going to stop and drop your book and stop reading and never pick up another book by you again because they didn't understand what you were talking about. They got lost. So that's how to know if your fictional transitions are working, is if your reader is well oriented. And that's the goal of a transition, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, is to keep your reader oriented so they know where they are, they know sort of where they're about to go in the short term, and they want to know more about the details of what that short term next piece is. So these transitions, you can put them. The obvious transitions when you look at a book like The Lord of the Rings are more in between scenes or in between chapters, where the first sentence makes it clear that you're with a different group of people. So once the fellowship in The Lord of the Rings sort of breaks up, and you've got Gandalf in one place and Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli in another place, and you have Frodo and Sam in a third place. Those transitions are the first sentences where it makes it clear which of those three people you're with. And sometimes if you're naming your chapters, that transition can even happen in the title of the chapter. So I've seen a lot of romance novels where they will say chapter 1, Anna, and then chapter 2, Mark, and chapter 3, Anna, or, chapter 3, Mark, depending on how the point of view changes from chapter to chapter. And that's a good way of having a short transition that just gives your reader that clue that the person they're going to be with for this section, the scene, the chapter, is who it is, right? You don't want them to think they're reading about Mark when really they're reading about Anna. That's where you get confused and lose people. So these transitions, this relates a lot to dialogue tagging. And there's a lot of controversy about how to do it, whether you only use said or you use little action phrases and like she scrunched her eyebrows together really ferociously, stuff like that. And how you do those tagging, that tagging is really up to you. And so long as you're consistent with yourself, so long as you are confident in your own voice and have chosen something and stuck to it within one story, obviously different stories require different types of style sometimes. But having those tags of I can't talk. He said, she said, that type of tagging is a transition. It lets your reader know who's saying what when, so that they don't get lost in trying to count whether there were, have I read 4 lines of dialogue or 5? Which person is it? I'm confused. That's you lose people again that way. And if you have a dialogue with more than 2 people, it gets even more confusing. I mean, when you have a collective council meeting style thing, like in Lord of the Rings again, if Tolkien hadn't put dialogue tags in there for, when the different people were arguing and saying things, it would have gotten super confusing super fast. And one way to deal with an argument is just to describe the feeling of the argument instead of saying what every single person is saying. But sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes you have an argument with 3 people on 3 different sides. Arguments don't have 2 sides always. And what they're saying is important because you need them to collectively come to a conclusion so that they can continue working together. And you need the reader to understand how each one of them contributes to that final decision. Then you really need your dialogue tags because, and you can try to make it feel like they're talking over each other by how you phrase things and where you use dashes. But making sure that you have clear dialogue tags to mark the transition from one person speaking to the next is so important to keep your readers with you and to make sure that they're not lost. Again, theme of transitions, make sure your reader is not lost. And again, like within a scene, the transitions are what bring you from one point of a story start to the next. So if your scene has each scene, each story, each chapter has a story star in it. And so when I do my when I move from my storyboard to my full detailed outline, I actually use a story star for each scene. And I write out a line or two per point of a story star within each scene. Um, and that sort of gives me a very detailed, nested outline that keeps me on track so that I know, okay, they might start here and end here, and these are the things they have to meet in the middle, and they can wander a little bit in between. But it gives me a guidepost, and it's a detailed map instead of just a, New York is east of here. Go east. Because if I went east from here, I probably would not get to New York very effectively. Um, that's why that's why I like a little bit more detail in my outlines. But in between each story star point, you have a transition. And a lot of what I do when I'm writing and when I'm thinking about how a scene is going to go is I look at my outline and I see these points for each point of the story star. I see these little one-liners. And so I think about, okay, how did they move? How did these characters move from the inciting incident of this scene to the complication? How does that happen? Is it a fast thing? Do they discover that someone has been shot and therefore they go investigate it, and as soon as they get there they realize that they were shot with someone's gun and the gun was stolen, but nobody knew the gun was stolen, and that's a complication? Or is it something that's more long and drawn out? Do they realize that they were supposed to get something in the mail, but they didn't, and so instead of calling the people who were supposed to mail it, they just wait and pretend it's not a problem, even though that shipment was really important because they can't get any work done in the meantime. You know, that 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 has a lot to do with the personalities of the characters and with your style as a writer. And I find it fascinating just to think about, how different people transition from one thing to the next. And sometimes those transitions only make sense in the head of the person. So I do this a lot of the time when I'm talking to people, is I'll have this realization and I'll say it and it'll sound like a complete non sequitur. But that's because in my head, there are all of these logical steps that happened in a split second in my thought process. And the people I'm talking to are not telepathic. They're not in a fantasy novel. So they don't know what all of those steps are. And so I have to make a conscious effort sometimes to remember that people can't read my mind and that I have to go back and explain how I got from point A to point B in the conversation and to tie it all back together. And that's another way you can do a transition, is you can have a character who's like that maybe and have a very abrupt change, but then go and explain it a little bit, make it clear to your reader how the character made that change or why they made that change so abruptly. Yeah, transitions are so much fun. I would not have said that 10 years ago. 10 years ago, transitions were the bane of my existence. But the more you understand them and the more you practice with them and the more you use them, the more fun they get. Yeah, everything you think of as a change is a transition. And if you think about it as a way of keeping your reader with you and keeping them engaged and excited and wondering about what's going to happen next, I think it really helps you figure out how to explain what happens, how to write your narrative and your dialogue in such a way that it's clear without being boring. That was always my problem. So this is why I hated transitions 10 years ago, is because I wasn't comfortable with them. I didn't have practice with them, and I didn't I didn't understand the breadth of them. So I was trying to use the same transition over and over and over again. So things like, she woke up in the morning and it was really cold and she had to get out of bed anyway. That's fine once, but every chapter, not so much. Um, and back to the, to touch on nonfiction for just a moment. The transitions in nonfiction can sometimes feel more straightforward because you have words like thus or therefore, however, consequently, in contrast, similarly. But again, those are the short transitions, and if you're using only those short little transition words, then it gets really boring. You want a good blend of short and long, and you want a good blend of styles and different ways of talking about the same type of transition, especially if you have something that's very, very cyclical. So I'm working on a story. It's another serial. It's called Tatterhood because it's based off of a Norwegian folktale called Tatterhood, and I was gonna change the name, but I decided not to. Um, and for that serial, I want to mirror some of the Old Norse poems, the things you would find in the Edda. I want an introduction and an ending to each episode that is a line of poetry or a stanza of poetry, really, that has the same song-like feel that a bard would have used to do their introduction to one of the poems of the Edda. And so I want that to be very structured, but at the same time, I want it to be unique to each episode. So I want each episode of the serial to have a poem at the beginning that reminds you of the atmosphere, of the feeling of this story, but then gives you, a couple details of what happened before and how long it's been since. And at the end, I want a couple details of, sort of a couple details that make the ending clear and make it clear that something new is about to happen the next time. So you can have transitions that are structured like that in a very clear way, in a very consistent way, over and over and over again, and that has power of its own. But you want to do that on purpose and not by accident. Um, when you do it by accident, it feels awkward. It makes it read like you don't know what you're writing about. Um, and that loses you readers again. So making sure that you have a variety of transitions, that you're using them on purpose, really helps you know whether or not your story on paper is how it is in your head. That was also one of the hardest things for me when I was writing 10 years ago, was I would have to write everything at least twice, minimum, whether it was fiction or nonfiction. I had to write everything at least twice because when I finished writing it the first time, that was when I knew what I was trying to talk about. And so I had to start over completely from scratch in order to be logical and consistent and put in those transitions as the third pass through at the end, not when I was necessarily completely rewriting, but after I had gotten the final logical order of the scene or the article. I had to go through and put in those transitions last to check and make sure, okay, I'm not using too many of the same kind. I'm not using too many short ones. I'm not using too many long ones. I'm using a combination, and it all makes sense. And it took me several times through. But since then, I have, been doing the same type of writing for so many years that now it all happens in my head. It happens between taking my ideas and writing writing the storyboard. It happens between moving from the storyboard to the detailed outline with the story star points. And it happens as I'm writing from that detailed outline. So when I go through to check, I don't have to make as many changes. I still check. I always still check because I never, like, there's no way of knowing what I forgot if I don't check. I'm not omniscient. I might want to be, but I'm not. So it's a good way to remember, put a little checklist together of things you need to check on your final pass through, or even some people find it much easier to be looking for one thing at a time. For me, that I'm backwards. One thing at a time, I distract myself in 2 seconds with a thought that's in my head that's interesting, that's not relevant to what I'm doing. So I need to be focusing on something more complicated. But it's a good idea. Like I have a checklist. It's got spelling and grammar. It's got naming consistency. It's got place consistency. Like forms of address consistency. So like if I decide that one country in the world addresses people as my lord and my lady, is that consistent throughout? Is the tone of voice of this character in her dialogue consistent throughout? Are the transitions good throughout? Do I ever lose the reader because I forgot to make a transition? And that happens sometimes. I write in scenes and I don't write in order. So sometimes I realize after I've written something that I need to change the order of a couple scenes. But I had written them intending them to be in a different order than they need to be. And so I need to change some of the time transitions and the place transitions to make it work in the final order. So checking for transitions in all the different kinds is a really, really good thing to do before you send your draft off to an editor or beta readers, because that makes it easier for them so they don't get lost and they can focus on whatever it is you're asking them to look for, instead of getting frustrated. You might want a reader to be frustrated at the end of an episode of a serial where there's a big cliffhanger because it's the end of an episode of a serial. But you don't want them to be frustrated in the middle of something, and you don't want them to be frustrated because they feel like you're expecting them to know something that they can't figure out. If you want them to be frustrated, you want them to be frustrated because you haven't released the next thing yet, and they want to know what happens next. You don't want them to be frustrated because they don't understand what just happened. Yeah. So I think that's all I have for fiction transitions today. Obviously, if you have more questions or want more examples of that, feel free to ask in the forum. I actually just finished putting the presentation I had done last year called Story Shapes the World. I just finished putting that into ebook format. So it's super short. I think it's maybe 3,000 words, but I decided it would be easier to read as an ebook than as a PDF, or a blog post or something. So I put it in a book. If you're part of the writers community, you can download that. You should be able to see it on the members homepage under your downloads links. And of course, if you're not part of the writers community yet, you can always join for free. And ask any questions you have about making transitions clearer. If you want more detailed examples, I can try and bring in some things from my own work to show you guys, if I know it's something you want to hear more about. So ask questions there, and I will be back to talk about nonfiction transitions in more depth another time. See you in the forum.